A bumper sporting weekend comes to a close. We've seen the end of Roland Garros, the end of India Pakistan, and an equally dramatic end to a Canadian GP where every single thing in the world that could have gone wrong did go wrong. But tell me about it, Kunal. Every single thing that could possibly happen happens, and at the end of it all, the story remains the same. Max Verstappen ends up winning the race. Let's just call the show over here, right? We've seen this all for the last 2 years now. It's all too common.
It's all too common. It's what Montreal always gives us. One of the reasons why I absolutely love this circuit. But it wasn't a straightforward race win for him. He got lucky for once. He got lucky. I mean, when I say for once, as in, of course, he has been lucky several times. But in Miami, he got unlucky behind the safety car. This time he did get lucky and he won the race. And it was one of those races, Sommel, where we could have literally had three drivers who were equally quick and capable of scoring the race win. Lando Norris, post race, has said, I could have won. I had a 15-second lead. That safety car that made me win in Miami made me lose this time. That's what motor racing is all about. And Mercedes, with that brilliant restart call of tyre taking new tires for George Russell, actually gave him a chance to win as well.
Yeah, so many crazy incidents. And look at it this way, right? I think this has to be one of the best race weekends we've had so far this year, which is a tough statement to make because this year genuinely has been a very good one for Formula One. But look at it this way, we had Russell very much in contention, a different car getting pole position, which is huge, by the way. We also saw Ferrari getting knocked out and not getting into Q3. We saw the McLarens also having a legitimate chance to win this race. And at the end of it all, Verstappen wins, and none of us are actually disappointed, which goes to prove the point, Kunal. It doesn't matter who wins, so long as we had a good race. And I'd say today, it was a solid 9 on 10 of a race. I mean, that is a proper Grand Prix. But at certain points, you're not even sure of what strategy is going to be the best one. Like, there was literally a point where I think in lap 46, the top three had three different tire compounds on their tires.
Firstly, firstly, your
Uh-huh.
rating almost never makes sense for me. I don't know how it's a 9 on
Come
10 or a
on.
7.
It's
No,
a
I mean,
good race.
no, yeah, but why 9 on 10 and not 9.5 or 10 on 10 or 10.5 on 10? Like, what is a rating parameter? We need a special episode just for that. Samuel Aurora's F1 Grand Prix rating parameter, just like there are
The
some
one
driver
point has been
rating.
deducted because Ferrari weren't there in the top three, and Carlos Sainz just made us remind. This reminded us of Sebastian Vettel from the late 2010s, which nobody wants to be reminded of. So that's why I'm taking 1 point off. That's the only reason.
Either way, Either way, I think it was a great race. I don't have a rating. I almost never do. I think all races are either 1 on 10 or 10 on 10. That's where I leave it if you know where I go. Because there are a lot of narratives one can take away from every race. This is where I get boring. But you spoke of strategy. But there were three key moments of strategy in my mind. First, the Haases deciding to start on the wets and not the inters. Okay, to me that was
Yeah.
absolutely incredible because the Haases just took a gamble and then they were just flying all around because that was actually the right tire to be on. The strange thing, Somil, is that the drivers absolutely hate the wets, which is why they take on the inters even when the conditions are for the wets. So it was one of those situations where they're, I'm not going to take the right tire because we don't like it. And they've been pretty vocal about it. So that was one
Yeah.
part. Haas is flying in the early stages of the race.
It's a very harsh thing to do, isn't it? Like, why don't we just put on wet tires? Why don't we just race each other in the first lap of the Monaco Grand Prix when we're dead last? That sort of stuff. It's very wild.
But this time they actually got the race. I mean, Kevin Magnussen, can you imagine the driver with 10 penalty points, one crash away from a race ban or whatever you call it, was the went from 18th to whatever 14th to 4th or
Yeah.
something in the first 6 laps of the race. And then, of course, the Haas thing was they actually gave him a bad pit stop. Okay, so that's what sort of cost him. But so that was one strategy standout for me. The second, I would say, was Yuki Tsunoda and Esteban Ocon actually going 44 laps on the Inter. So they didn't make a switch to the new Inters under the safety car. They decided to stay out, gain track position. They were running in the top 10. So they did that. Ocon went from 18th to 10th, scoring points. He was 8th and then
Yeah.
was overtaken by Ricardo. Team orders came into play with Gasly. But the third and the most crucial one was what I just said at the start, where Mercedes had that free pit stop to make under the last safety car. They bolted on the new tires, and then George Russell was absolutely flying. As was Lewis Hamilton, before people jump onto me, just that George was on the medium. So that was flying
Which
a
is
little bit
where,
faster.
yeah, exactly. Which is where this race seems to be a race of false dawns in my eyes, because there were so many false dawns where we thought, wow, well, this could be the start of something, and it didn't. You talk about Haas at the start, and eventually them potentially getting a good position, that terrible pit stop, and eventually the way things cycled out, they just didn't have any advantage. And yet again, Haas were 11th and 12th. It pains. But the second thing, Daniel Ricciardo's false start was a false dawn as well. Luckily for him, touchwood, he ended up scoring some points and shutting off Jacques Villeneuve just slightly, but we'll find out more as the season goes on. But another real false dawn in this whole scenario as well was Lando Norris getting the lead canal. And at one point in time, right, 15 seconds up ahead, the safety car comes in. Let's just talk about, could Lando Norris have won this race had it not been for that safety car? I genuinely believe the answer could well be no, because had the safety car had come out at the right time and Lando Norris would have been in the right scenario to pit, it just could have been very tricky anyway, because once the lead pack would have been bunched up after the safety car, having someone like Max Verstappen behind you is a very, very tough task. And even on top of that, that whole what if dilemma remains. Would McLaren have then kept Lando Norris out a couple of extra laps had he been in the lead? I just feel it's so many hypothetical scenarios that you just find it a little hard to imagine that McLaren could have won, even if the safety car would have been there on time. Because again, so much happened in the second half of the race as well.
Oh, I definitely think McLaren would have won the race, hands down,
Definitely, seriously.
without a
Like
doubt. Yeah, because they had the
one,
pace.
Verstappen versus Norris in the wets. Do you think Norris could have kept it on?
Absolutely. I don't see why he
Oh
wouldn't
wow.
have kept it on. I think he would have. None of these drivers are intimidated by Max Verstappen. Let me put it that way. Okay, firstly, which is how it should be. I mean, we may appreciate Max for what he does, but like Lando Norris said, yeah, Max was just ahead, but he wasn't as. He said he was quicker, but not as quick that I couldn't have challenged for the win. Right? It was just the timing of the safety car in his mind, at least, and I would say so. It was also a track position after a point, and we've seen in these cars, track position is typically vital to staying ahead or not, unless you have a very massive tire delta like George Russell had towards the end of the race as well, right? So I think Lando Norris was in a position to win if McLaren would have done the right thing. But I anyway think they did the right thing because even on
Yeah.
those old Inters, he was quicker. He was pulling out a gap. He had what, a 22-second gap or something to Max Verstappen. He actually came out just alongside Max Verstappen. Okay, so he did pull out that lap and the gap that he needed. It just so happened that the pit exit, which was not used so much, was more wet. And of course, McLaren knew all of this. They were gambling, and I absolutely
Yeah.
love it when they gambled there.
Yeah. And talking about the first safety car and could McLaren have done anything differently? The answer is no. When you look at the footage once again, Lando Norris was clearly in a place where he couldn't have stopped and made that pit stop. So he had to go that extra lap to make that stop anyway. And that's the reason why eventually McLaren lost that track position at that point in time. But you're right, they were gambling and they were faster at one point in time. But another false dawn in that whole aspect is Red Bull Racing complaining about Max Verstappen. Actually, Verstappen complaining about the car not being able to ride the curves very well and saying that, oh, I've got to stay away from the curves. I can't ride on them. And us thinking, well, maybe if he cannot ride on the curves, which are vital at Montreal, he'll probably go slower and end up losing the race. That didn't work out very well, did it? That's another false dawn to had it.
Especially in that final restart where he pulled away,
Yeah.
1 second, over a second under just a lap or something. He was riding those curbs very hard. So of course, when he says I can't ride those curbs, it's not that he can't ride them. It's just that he chooses to not ride them, which means that when he wants to, when he needs to, he is going to ride them. And he said this suspension is locked. It was like he was driving a go-kart out there.
But can we just say, Verstappen on the restarts, this guy is probably the best in Formula One. Like, I've never seen him buckle under any restart, ever. And we've been
That's
watching him for what, 8 years now, more or less?
Yeah, that's true. Max
Incredible.
Verstappen, yeah, I mean, there is no doubt that he is the talent of this generation, is yet to put a foot wrong, especially in this era of Formula One, as he's had the dominant car and has had the momentum and confidence and all those things that are needed. But to me, my favorite Max Verstappen moment actually came at the end of the race when he was being interviewed by Martin Brundle, and Martin Brundle asked him, "How satisfied are you with that victory?" And Max just said thank you and walked away. Okay, so either he was able
Oh,
to hear, and he didn't choose to reply. He probably just he didn't hear Martin Brundle's question. But so there was a Max Verstappen false dawn, where him turning around and saying how satisfied he was to win his 60th race in Formula One
uh-huh.
was something that we missed out on. But we probably could have guessed that answer from Max Verstappen either way. But when we talk of Max Verstappen, we have to talk of Checo Perez. Got a renewal. The renewal is not a bit of a surprise. It's the length of that renewal, 2 years. But 2 years of this, driver not making it a Q3, driver spinning around and just having a bad weekend. Can you believe it? I mean, Max Verstappen is up there
Yeah.
battling the Mercedes and the McLarens, and Checo Perez just waiting around. I don't know. Red Bull gives him
Well,
wings, but he decided to just throw them off in the barriers.
yeah, broken wings. Yeah. That they didn't work out very well. Driver error, properly. Driver error in that case. And if the reports are to be believed correctly, isn't that a 1 year plus 1 year extension, similar to what they had for Yuki Tsunoda's contract?
I think it's a
I'd
2 year
say
deal, if I
so.
remember. Yeah. Checo Perez has managed to get a 2 year deal. And I think it's one of those rewards for not beating Max Verstappen in a race for over a year. And then they said, you know what, you actually deserve a 2 year deal because that's what we want a number two driver to do, not beat Max Verstappen. Okay, so anyway, I'm joking. We've got
So hang
lots
on,
of
are you
listeners
basically
in
telling me the
Mexico.
criteria to be the Red Bull number two is not to do well?
No, I'm
So
just kidding. I'm
everything
just
that
kidding.
you've
Yeah.
been no, but basically, but that's what it feels like, does it not? That performances like what we saw this weekend and also what we've seen over the course of the last couple of years now are being excused. And I wonder what the scenario is. Is it a case of Red Bull not having good options in the background? Do they not trust Yuki Tsunoda enough? Do they not see Ricardo as being ready enough to get back in that seat? Again, Jacques Villeneuve clearly believes so. Or do they not have enough belief in Liam Lawson to put him straight up into that Red Bull? And is it just a commercial factor of having someone like Checo weighing them in? Or the main reason, which I believe to be the case, is that they believe that keeping peace in the team is more important to generating performance together than it is to have some chaos and then having both their drivers not doing well. Like they believe in Max so much that they're willing to sacrifice the other driver so that he can give 1.5x of what the other driver can give.
But that's what's happening. Max is giving them what they need. Like Helmut Marko says, it's the Max Verstappen factor that's actually helping Red Bull go ahead. And to think of it, Helmut Marko also said Checo Perez sells a lot of merchandise, which is easy to believe. And like Ralf Schumacher probably joked on Sky Germany, saying they need Checo Perez to bring in all the money, given all the multi-million-dollar contracts that they have signed with Max Verstappen for winning. So basically, Perez brings in all the money so that they can keep Max Verstappen signed up at the super duper 100+ million whatever he must be making after all his racing achievements on track. So anyway, but that's the Checo Perez conundrum. We're going to discuss this, like I said, for the next 2 years. But I must say, his performance in the before the upgrade came in, his performances were not bad, Somen. He was actually up there. It's just that when the upgrades have come in and Red Bull is taking time to understand the car, when they are lost with the car, Checo Perez is lost even more with the car, whereas Max Verstappen is still able to find himself somewhere out there. So that's the false dawn about Checo Perez. And another false dawn, Lewis Hamilton setting the fastest lap,
Yeah,
lost out on the podium.
yeah.
He actually had Mercedes scored their first uh, podium of the season, and like F1 stats guru who couldn't make it to this episode, actually sent us a great stat that George Russell is yet to win a race from pole position in his Formula One career. Okay,
Uh,
and Mercedes has
Interestingly,
been on the podium at every Canadian Grand Prix since 2013. So the signs were there all along for Mercedes, right? But Lewis Hamilton actually turned out and said the positive signs with the car, but this was my worst race ever. I didn't have a positive feeling with what I was doing.
And it was so funny because in the entirety of the race, Hamilton was a little bit of an afterthought compared to Russell. And then at the end, there was one speck of light and one speck of hope where you thought, yes, Hamilton, is he going to get a podium on the hard compound tires? What a genius decision. And it vanished quicker than it came. It all fell off and eventually got passed by Russell in the end. What a
And
false dawn that was, huh?
Lewis actually had to choose between the medium and the hard, and he chose the hard. And he actually said, "Can I take the soft?" But Mercedes says, "We don't think we should risk it with the soft." Just putting some context out there. And or I think he used up the medium, so the hard was the only choice he could have made. If my I'll have to go through my notes to verify this, but that's where it was. But another false dawn, if I may go ahead on that. Alexander Albon pulled off a brilliant double overtake on Ocon and Tsunoda on those old
Yeah.
inters that we spoke of, right? He was running in the points, so he should have technically finished the second race in succession in the points. But guess what happened? Carlos Sainz spun and then just collected him back and threw him off. And Albon knew that this is it, my race is done, just as he was trying to cross Sainz.
One second. Why are you talking about this? Why?
Because
I
imagine
thought we weren't.
Williams scoring points,
Yes,
and they were
but
taken out by a driver who is probably going to join them next year.
don't rub it in like that. Come on, don't rub it in like that. It's been the worst possible weekend for Carlos. You don't rub it in like that. You know the amount of hurt that all of us are feeling, right? Because of this,
No, no,
the fact that
it's
he
you.
has no options, then he has to go to
It- it-
Williams,
uh,
and then he has this weekend similar to Seb in the past. Come on, don't do that. Come on, you don't
what,
have to
all
rub it
of
in.
us or you? Who are you talking of?
Seriously, no, I can say all of us this time because it was not just him, but Charles Leclerc as well who had all these troubles, which was baffling to my mind because in qualifying, we all thought, yes, they're going to carry forward the momentum. And this ideally shouldn't be a terrible Ferrari track. But as it turns out, as beautiful Mercedes were in qualifying, Ferrari were just as terrible. And a lot of it can be boiled down to probably not the ideal warm ups, the tires not being in the right temperature, maybe them being slightly overconfident about things. But the end result, we never imagined it could have been this bad, especially in changeable conditions where if you're starting lower and have a faster car, you theoretically can do a lot more. But it just didn't quite work out. And especially with Leclerc, I liked the fact that they had to stop the car to do a factory reset. And then they took the gamble on the hards. And just as they pitted, it eventually got better. And then, had the Ferrari been working properly, who knows where they could have been? Maybe a couple of points here and there.
I like how you're saying, who knows where they could have been, and then you're saying maybe a couple of points here and there. So I clearly like the you know Ferrari couple of points is typically what Williams would be going for. But I think Ferrari was
I'll have to reset my
just
expectations now, Kunal, with Carlos
yeah,
Sainz. That's what I'm
exactly.
doing. I'm
Please do.
resetting my expectations for 25. That's all.
The earlier the better, because of course it is heartbreaking to see him not get that seat. With Mercedes now saying Kimi is our focus, even though we hope and wish Carlos gets a top seat, etc. But everybody says that, right? You always give sympathy, but you'd still do
Yeah.
what you want to do. But on the whole Red Bull, sorry, on the whole Ferrari conversation, I think Ferrari's turned around and said, let's not overreact. Okay, we didn't overreact after winning in Monaco. Let's not overreact after having such a bad weekend in Montreal. They're pretty positive that this is a one-off blip in performance and that they'll be back in the front in Barcelona. And this is something that they'll look to iron out, that even on a bad weekend, they should be taking home some points, not completely going off, because that's what a top team would do, like a Mercedes or a Red Bull and the likes. On a bad weekend, you still take away some points, right? I also believe it's the cooler conditions that probably took away Ferrari from their setup. That this is all, sensitivities are so much with car setups, and everybody talks of widening a setup window, finding the sweet spot. Something Mercedes could do with much ease, and it was also one of the reasons that the front wing that they added in Monaco, which both the drivers finally had in Montreal. If you remember in Monaco, Lewis said, "I'll never beat George Russell in qualifying ever," and then he said, "I chose not to take the front wing." He actually did take the front wing in Montreal, and they were really quick. Okay, so it's just these finer nuances, and these are those inside points that you and I and Sundaram pick up each time. That's why we've got so many thousands of listeners for each episode, Somil.
Actually, on those little insights, I want to dig something out from you, right? Because while I was watching the race and while I was listening to all the commentary and all the storytelling around the fact that there was, at one point in time, rain expected in around 10 minutes, but the intermediate tires were also wearing out heavily, and there was also a dry line appearing on the track, which would only worsen the impact of the tires. And there was also a safety car risk. So, in that period of time where you're confused about all that's happening, I was just wondering, man, there must be so much overthinking in that pit lane. All the engineers, all the strategists thinking, if it rains now, what do we do? If the tires are chewed out now, what do we do? If the safety car comes up now, what do we do? And these sort of scenarios, right? It must be such a nerve wracking thing to be a strategist for a Formula One team where you're constantly calculating different scenarios. Of course, you do a lot of it beforehand, but in the middle of the race as well, it must have been just a strategist's nightmare when you're in that weird little unpredictable scenario where you can't really tell how much the tires will last or when the rain will come or when a safety car could come, which eventually did happen.
But I don't think there's overreacting that happens. As strategists are used to
Overthinking,
this.
maybe a little bit?
Oh yeah, oh, no, I don't think there's overthinking either. At least not with the top teams. Because let's go back to this scenario of the race. They're running on the inters. George is leading, and then Max is chasing, and McLarens are chasing, and they're saying rain in 10 minutes. Now at that time, everybody is in the same situation, which is that the inters are not the right tires to be on. It's
Yeah.
either the slicks, assuming it's the slicks. So the turns 1 and 2 was the reason why they couldn't take the slicks. Turns 1 and 2 were still wet, but not good for the slicks, which is why all the drivers on the radio were saying it's dry everywhere, it's slicks everywhere, but turns 1 and 2. Okay, so you either wait for turns 1 and 2 to clear up. That's what happens when you want to sort of have the crossover, or you just wait that everybody's inters degrade because everybody's in the same
Yeah.
point, but you do not preemptively make a move because you will lose track position. Okay, or you wait for an interruption. Either the rain comes, the interruption you're waiting for to get to the next set of inters, or you wait for a safety car, another interruption that you require to get to the next stage of the race. So it's fairly simple, and by the time you're actually at the Grand Prix weekend, or sorry, you're at the Grand Prix during the Grand Prix, you anyway have a limited set of tires available because you've used up most of the
Yeah.
tires for the rest of the race weekend. So you know which your preferred tires are. And giving you an example, like I spoke of the Lewis Hamilton example where he wanted the soft, and then he was told it's too risky. Oscar Piastri, another example, was told, Oscar, if there was a safety car now, what would you take, the medium or the hard? And then he asked how many laps were left. And he said, okay, if these many laps are left and there's a safety car now, I'm going to take the medium. So a lot of this is teams already having the data, drivers already knowing at what stage their race is. They discuss a lot of these scenarios throughout. And I think it's the teams just know what's what. And maybe in the case of Ferrari, there was a bit of overthinking this weekend, especially with Leclerc. They put him on the hard, they put him on the inter. They had an engine issue. They were losing a second and a half a lap. So they said, can we just run things as we test as they go? Leclerc, declared post race that Ferrari were asking him to make a lot of settings changes on the steering wheel dash to get the power unit back in action. And that was actually trickier because of
Yeah.
anyway, the racing was not that easy. And then eventually it seems that his power unit issues were solved, but they still decided to retire from the race because classic Leclerc radio messages, and he was very decisive on the radio, Samuel. He
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
asked, what's our target? What's the objective of running right now? Okay, and then promptly a few laps later, they retired the car.
And I also liked the fact that he established boundaries, sort of, in a way, with or other communication standards with his engineer. When his new race engineer eventually ended up asking, rather telling him that there was just enough of a gap that he was losing out with the power unit. And then Leclerc was like, no, stop with the ambiguity. Tell me, how much are we losing on the straights? And that's a learning for him as well. Don't tell Leclerc the ambiguous stuff because some drivers actually prefer it that way. I mean, I don't blame the engineer because sometimes you don't need to know because eventually that compounds your performance because you're in a cycle of negativity like, oh, I'm losing this much, I'm losing this much, I'm losing this much. But it's different with Leclerc, clearly. And it's interesting to see those dynamics play out right before our very, very eyes. As is another interesting dynamic, which is what's going on at Alpine. And this is a crazy stat. I mean, F1 stats guru has really pulled out a really interesting one where Esteban Ocon has now got a 100% scoring record in Canada, which is the race where Alpine were actually considering dropping him for this season as well. I mean, why would they do that? Eventually, they did the right decision. They didn't drop him for this race, they dropped him for next season. But eventually, points for Ocon. And at the end, it was also chaotic because Ocon was in the points and Gasly wasn't, but then it got switched around because of all the madness.
Yes, and that madness is very important to discuss, right? Because
Yeah,
the,
that
the chain of
was.
the chain of events was somebody released a rumor saying Bruno Famin said there'll be consequences. Esteban Ocon said there's a lot of hate and whatever. We spoke about it in the preview, and he said I'm going to race in Canada. And Alpine said yes, you'll race in Canada, but you're not going to race next season with us, okay? And then they of course spoke of a split. But in the race, Ocon actually drove brilliantly well on those old inters to keep position ahead of Pierre
Seriously, yeah.
Gasly and Daniel Ricciardo as well. Then they asked if they could swap, but the swap was ordered 3 laps to the end, and then Ocon asked why, and they said we're going to try and get Daniel, and Ocon said it's not going to happen. Okay, they one would assume that they would swap back. Typically, that's what teams do. You swap and then you swap back. So Esteban Ocon was livid post race. He actually said I did what I had to do, but the team didn't. And then they said, it's a long way into the
Oh,
season, 15 races to go. So, clearly it's reached that bitter, extremely bitter moment already in their first race after they've announced a split. But for Alpine, for the first time, Samuel, they have scored double points at a race meet, which means they're now eighth in the Constructors' Championship, 2 points behind Haas in seventh place, but crucially 3 points ahead of Williams in ninth place. So that's actually worked for them.
1 second. Let's just take bets now. We should do this. What are you betting on, listeners? Do you think this partnership is going to last until what race are we talking about here? Until
Abu
let's
Dhabi?
just throw a
No.
marker. Abu Dhabi?
Okay.
No, Abu Dhabi is too late. Yeah, maybe Singapore. Do you think we're going to last till Singapore? My feeling is no, just for fun. But what do you think, Kunal? I don't think this is going to work out.
I
Not
think
this way.
they'll be forced to make it work. Okay, with the car getting better. Like for example, Ocon had the heavier Alpine this weekend. They'll be forced to make it work. But we're gonna get box office radio messages and statements. It's like if Hamilton is going to make a statement against Mercedes each time, like I said, even earlier, like yesterday he said after qualifying, I'm losing half a second, I didn't change anything and I don't know. And these are kind of those spicy statements. I think with Ocon we're going to get bitter spicy statements. It's like they're not good spice, but we're going to get spicy statements against Alpine
One
time and time again.
second. So, do you say there's going to be no Bruno famine of interesting radio messages? Ta-dum.
Do you really
That's
want
a
to hear
good one.
Bruno Famine? I want to. I always want to hear
No, you didn't get
the
it. No,
the
there's going to be no famine of radio of good radio messages
oh
like this. That
my
way.
yeah. Talking of Bruno Famine, Toto Wolff came onto the
That was a
radio to
bad
tell
one.
George
That was a
Russell.
bad one.
Toto Wolff came onto the radio to tell George, focus, George, focus. They actually went onto the radio to tell George Russell that towards the end of the
Yeah.
race. But another team to talk about, Samuel, Aston Martin. They actually said that Canada would suit their package the best and they needed to get double points or whatever. And they maximized performance. They scored double points, sixth and seventh, 14 points, the highest point score at any race this weekend. So they knew that their package was going to, be best in Canada. They delivered maximum points in Canada. I wonder if this was because it's a Stroll's home race and they wanted to show that or not. But for the first time since Melbourne, Aston Martin has scored points with both cars.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Fernando Alonso not just congratulated Lance Stroll, he congratulated all the drivers. Fernando Alonso, the statesman, he said most of the
Oh.
race, the racetrack was just 2 meters wide. You couldn't put your tire outside of the dry line. So congratulations to everyone for keeping it clean.
Is this the same person, Kunal? We don't know this guy, do we? I don't know this guy. Who is this guy? This is not the Fernando Alonso I know.
Well, it's the same person who actually even said Lance Stroll is ready to lead Aston Martin in Formula One even after he has retired. So there we go.
Man, I something is up. This is not the same guy we grew up watching. Clearly, something is up. Maybe,
Yes.
maybe the Aston Martin money is probably corrupting the clarity of thought, and sometimes you end up saying things that maybe you don't believe.
I don't know.
Maybe, who
I
knows?
don't care.
Who
Who,
knows?
who cares? As long as Fernando is racing in Formula One till such time he wants to, because Lance Stroll is going to continue to do that as well. But for once, actually, Jacques Villeneuve didn't pounce on Lance Stroll. He pounced on Daniel Ricciardo. Said, you know, hurtled out some brutal facts, and Ricardo said he can say what he wants, etc. But it's always good if this is the kind of Ricardo we get. But we get this Ricardo in flashes, and he goes away 5 races, and then he comes in a flash and goes away. And
Yeah.
even today, Tsunoda was actually ahead of Ricardo when Tsunoda actually had that unfortunate spin and then crash and whatever, he went out of the points. But some of that actually also led to a scary situation because Nico Hulkenberg literally
Yeah.
missed Yuki Tsunoda head on by a few millimeters. He said that he actually said I had my eyes half closed. I was bracing for impact. Yeah, Nico Hulkenberg. And well, just the story of how racing will always be dangerous. And actually, talking of dangerous, spectators invaded the track this weekend before the race actually ended. So the local
No
promoters,
way.
Octane Racing Group or whatever it's called, have been summoned by the FIA for this misbehavior or lack of organizing skills or whatever you call it.
Lack of well promotion. What's the term we can use here?
I don't know. Maybe the race was so excited, everybody had the adrenaline rush and they just let the spectators on track. But either way, that's always the scariest thing to do, as everyone knows. So I wonder if there'll be a financial penalty or the likes. But one of the best circuits to actually go racing on, like we said in the preview, we spoke of the curbs in the preview, Max's vengeance in the preview, qualifying in the preview, everything literally just
Yeah.
fired, Somil.
Yeah, seriously, seriously. So again, we've got to say so.
Including, I'll tell you what else fired. Lance Stroll's PR overdrive fired to a level where Pirelli called him a three-time race winner. Okay,
Yeah.
and they Pirelli released a press release saying Lance Stroll deserves to be in Formula One. To me, that is the most ridiculous thing. Okay, that I've ever read or experienced in Formula One.
No, no, no. Wait, wait, wait. We will come up with something even more ridiculous now. This will really hurt your brain because F1 Stats Guru has come up with a really crazy stat that Lance Stroll has more points finishes in Canada, 5 from 6 races, than the man on who the circuit is named after, Gilles Villeneuve himself. Lance Stroll has more points finishes in Canada than Gilles Villeneuve. Circuit Lance Stroll coming up soon for 2026. This is going to be it, right? That's going to be the proper PR overdrive ending.
My goodness, is that what we're going to grow up to? Is that what my child is going to grow up to 20 years from now? Circuit
Circuit
Gilles
Lance
Villeneuve will
Stroll,
be renamed to Circuit Lance Stroll.
yeah, is
Oh
celebrating
my
his highness and his
goodness.
brilliance.
Oh my goodness. But
But
why don't we take a
yeah,
look at the Drivers' Championship? Some very interesting things have happened. So, Daniel Ricciardo, courtesy of his 4 points, has finally jumped Oliver Behrman for 12th place. Okay.
way.
Lance Stroll is now 2 points away from Yuki Tsunoda for 10th place in the Drivers' Championship. Okay. Pierre Gasly, with his 2 points, actually jumped Alexander Albon for 15th place. And Esteban Ocon, the reason why he was pissed about that extra point that he lost, even though Alpine gained, is because he's now 17th with 2 points when he could have actually been tied for 15th with Gasly with 3 points, right? So just some movements in the bottom part, something that we don't really end up tracking all the time, right, Samuel?
Yeah, yeah. And also Leclerc has had his second place gap chopped off massively after not having any points this weekend. So that whole scenario is also opening up where we have Lance Stroll, sorry, Lando Norris legitimately in the fight for second place. So it's all turning out to be a good season after all. But
Yeah, yeah,
last
and
question for today.
Checo Perez has
Yeah,
gone two race
yeah,
weekends without scoring a point. He has been, he was overtaken by Carlos Sainz last race weekend itself. So 1 point
yeah.
separates them. Carlos Sainz is on 108 and Checo Perez is on 107.
It's insane. It is insane. We will see how that plays out eventually. But the last question for today, Kunal. Performer of the weekend. Who do you really can give it? Who can you really give it to? I'm confused because again, George Russell's driving this weekend was immaculate. Getting that pole position, leaving nothing on track. His driving was, I think, best as it could have been given the conditions and given the car on track as that he had in hand as well. But I'm equally conflicted because Lando Norris and Max Verstappen were just about as faultless. Piastri was the only driver in the top five who really didn't cut a corner and make that one mistake, but his pace was obviously not there. But I'm confused now. Verstappen, Norris, Russell, who really was
But,
the
but I,
performer of
I
the
think
weekend?
Piastri definitely had the pace. In fact, the reason why Piastri in the later stages of the race lost out was because he used up his tires faster than he should have. Something we've spoken of, where he's learning how to
Yeah,
drive slower on these tires, and he was experiencing training, and that's why Mercedes, of course, with the tire advantage, got the better of him, where he went from third to fifth literally in the race, right? But I don't think Piastri was bad. In fact, he's on 81 points, which is his car number either way, right?
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
I would say several performers this weekend. Difficult to choose one. George Russell in that Mercedes when the cars there, he put it on pole. Fantastic pole lap by George as well as Max. I love that there are two drivers who had the purple tag on them,
Yeah.
right till the third decimal point. So George Russell, great performer. Lando Norris, in the opening stages of the race, when he got his chance, he pulled that gap when he had to. So tough to choose, tough to not put him there as well. And even Max Verstappen, because if the Red Bull is literally the handful that they claim it is, or he claims it is, and we see what Checo Perez is not able to do, it is literally the Max Verstappen factor that got him the race win. And like you said at the start of the show, it doesn't matter who wins, it's just of how they end up winning the race. And all three drivers who were quick enough today to score the race win were actually in contention for the race win,
Yeah.
Somal.
And that's all that we can ask for from a Formula One race weekend. Seriously, that is all that we can ask for. Multiple drivers in contention, lots of pandemonium, lots of craziness, good hard racing towards the very end. And ultimately, we all go home happy, even if you're a fan of McLaren or Mercedes, because at the end, you got the best that you could potentially get. And if you're a Ferrari fan, you're hungry for more.
And the performer of the race weekend, also, if I had to pick one, was Brian Bosey. Okay.
Uh huh.
I mean, something is up with Leclerc and his race engineers. Okay. He needs to fix this because there was this moment when he took the hard tire and Brian said, okay, keep it on track, let the rain go, then we can go fast. Literally, he actually said that. And there was that big gamble that they took. And Leclerc is no longer the only driver who finished in the top four in all the races this season. So that's, I would say, Brian Bosey also a performer of the race weekend. Also, I would say the FIA suddenly, after being very lackadaisical in jump starts, have penalized Daniel Ricciardo for moving 1 or 1.5 millimeter at the start as well. You
Yeah.
could barely see him move. Drivers have moved much more, and now they've just suddenly tightened the screws up. So, what an exciting race that 40 minutes in, and we are still finding things we've not spoken of as much because just so many
Seriously.
things happened, Somal.
Seriously, seriously, what a weekend. And next time in Spain is going to be even better because that's where we really find out who ends up where. How are they in terms of performance and who really has the best chance of winning the championship this year. We shall find that out in a bit. But, folks, thank you for listening to this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast. We'll be back soon, so you better be right here. Subscribe to the podcast, share this episode with all your friends and family members who might be interested, and we will catch you in a bit. Bye bye.